let's change the context into dataset 3. This is dataset 3 is the other end of the continuum. And each one of you will like it more because it's much more fun to deal with categorical data. I'm telling you right away, even though it's hard to gather that information. So open up dataset 3. Okay, so this is data from a set of employees in the banking sector. Okay, and so you have data on education, and as you can see, the data is education is a level data, which basically means there are specific levels that have been defined. 1 being finished high school, 2 being finished some college courses, 3 being obtained a bachelor's degree, and so on. 5 being the highest, where you have obtained a graduate degree. Okay. Grade is the job grade, and job grades go from a code of 1 through 6, 6 being the highest level being it's much more responsibility, higher salary, and so on and so forth. Right, so that's the job grade category. Years 1, and there are 2 different ones. One is number of years of experience with that particular bank from which the data has been collected. Okay, and years 2 is basically giving you years of banking experience prior to working at this bank. So maybe you have worked somewhere else in some other bank, and how many years of experience you have there when you first interviewed and moved into this bank. Then you have your age. Where are you in your career? Of course, gender. There is a very defined gender bias in terms of salaries. PC job. And so you can, that kind of tells you how old the data is. Okay, PC job, as if it was a thing. There are people who had experience working with numbers in Excel, and people who just did it the old school way. Okay, and so it basically tells you whether you have whether your current job is computer driven or not. And then you have the salary of the individual. Okay, so this is probably the most balanced data set from all the 3 ones that we looked at, and this will hopefully ensure that we have questions that we look into multiple directions. So let's try and digest just the variables for a period of time. And again, the question, and this is what Ashley was talking about in the previous couple of ones, to try and see beyond the data into just the variables and ask yourself, okay, so what am I after? What am I after is the question you're asking yourself. Again, that in turn will lead you to that overarching question. Amy? What factors impact banking salary? Okay. What factors impact, yeah, salary in the banking industry, let's say? Because you can actually use the data from this bank and extrapolate that to any other bank. And so broadly, if in that industry, as you could see, the years of experience as an example, it's not only just taken into consideration how many internal years of experience you have for that bank, but when you're coming from some other bank, how is that taken into consideration? So that kind of gives you a feel that it's an industry issue. And so what factors impact salary in the banking industry? Very nicely put together question. So 30,000 foot view. I have salary. Broadly, what are some buckets based off of this data set that is impacting salary? Sarah? Experience, very good. And that experience bucket actually includes both what I have internally versus I have externally, right? So experience is definitely one of those factors. What else, Ryan? Education. Timothy, yes. Skills. And this is why I tell, give me just a second, Hunter, I'll get back to you. This is why I say this is such an old data set where you would think that in today's world, the computer skills would be integrated in the education. And there was once upon a time where you would have your regular education and you will take special courses in learning the computer. Okay, and those were your skill sets. And that would eventually go into your banking practice. Hunter. Let me go back to the data set real quick. Okay, so we have taken care of experience, we have taken care of education, we have talked about skills. Hunter is talking about the job grade, codes 1 through 6, 1 being the lowest grade and 6 being the highest one. And so how are you trying to define that, Hunter, one more time? Oh, so you are looking at the PC job or the grade one? Which one are you looking at? Okay, so they are two different areas. Yes, so the PC job is essentially if the job involves using the PC on a very, very regular basis versus the job involves you to travel more, to talk face to face with clients as opposed to using the PC. So there are two, that's the kind of factor that the PC job is talking about. The grade, and I want to ask this question to myself as well, where do you want to fit grade? The grade or the cadre under which you are joining. It could probably connect, have a dotted line relationship with both experience as well as education. At a certain level of education, you oftentimes join at a certain level. And so that the grade factor would go in dotted line with both education as well as experience because it kind of fits into both of them. When you graduate from high school, there is a certain level at which you start your apprenticeship program. Okay, I have a lot of students in my supply chain program who actually used to work at GE here, GE Aviation, and they started at the base level. Since high school, and they continued through their education. But the moment they earned their bachelor's degree, and during the bachelor's degree, they earned their green belt in Six Sigma and all that jazz. So suddenly now they are marketable at a very different rate. It's beyond just the experience. Of course, they had 4 years of experience while they were in school, but they also have a different bracket of education within which they have to comply. It's the same story even with foreign workers in this country. So if I'm sure with so much of immigration issues that have been discussed in the last 3 or 4 years, you are well aware of this concept of H-1B visa. So that's the foreign visa for foreign workers, skilled workers. Okay, so when they come in, there is a specific decree in place that they have to get a job within a certain field for a certain level of salary. You can't pay them less than that defined salary level. Okay, so that's in terms of the job. If the grade has 1 through 6, the H1B worker normally would want to join in at the level 4 or above, because that's when you can make a case that I don't have that kind of skills internally to fill it. That's why I'm going to ask for somebody else to fill that job. Then that applies to every single field within education as well as an industry. When I joined this university, I was an H1B applicant. Of course, from a education side, that's a different bracket. But just to give you a comparison, for my position, there were about 75 applicants. That's what my then chair, Dr. Paul Shikora, told me. 75 applicants, of which only 2 were US citizens. The rest of them were all internationals, because that's the area in which that specific job is housed. But then there is a certain definition of a salary range within which we have to be accommodated. So it was never an issue for us, because the business professor salary is normally at a pretty high range. So it more than compensates for the H1B expectation. But it can be a big deal, especially in the industry. And for those of you coming from IT, it's regularly exploited by many of our brethren, right, Timothy? So you have to be careful about that aspect of grade and how it is influenced by education as well. So with that said, let's look into a more detailed form of the puzzle. So this is a very nice 30,000 foot view setup. Let's now look into the conceptual model. So we are still looking into salary, and help me here. What are my factors? I completely forgot. Thank you so much. Very important. Demographics for age and gender. Very, very important. Thank you so much, Ashley. So yes, those are the broad buckets. Experience, education, skills, demographics. Okay, that eventually impacts salary. Okay, in a perfect world, you would want to tell yourself that demographics should not be the impact, right? That's a perfect world. We all know where it is. So thanks for reminding me. I forgot those 2 columns. I would eventually come back to that when I was defining this. So let's take into all of those factors into consideration. What did we think of when we thought about experience? So we talked about years in, and then we had years external. So they were both 2 different factors. Years in basically meaning the number of years that you have worked within that same bank. External years is number of years that you have worked from another bank and you are coming from another bank. Is there anything else that we can connect with experience? Well, yeah, the grade kind of dotted line connects with both. So I'll just put the grade in. So the grade at which you are entering, okay? And that basically brings the education part here. So there is education that's also going to impact your salary. What else? What am I missing? Just somebody have the Excel file open in front of you and you can guide me. So you have age, you have sex. What else? Skills. So PC job. And that's it. These are all the factors that we have. Okay. Let's look into each one of them. So salary is, and this is where this data set is so different from the previous one. The previous one was very hardcore data, quant driven, right? So here you have salary that is very hardcore quant, which is just a continuous data set. You have age that you can probably put into some kind of a continuous scheme. The rest of it, let's start with PC job. Whether you have a job that requires a PC or not. No versus yes. Is it categorical? Yes, no. Okay, so it's categorical data. Of course, sex is male, female, the way it has been defined in the data set, so it's categorical. Education type. Categorical, absolutely. 1 through 5 or whatever, 6, whatever those dimensions are. Okay. And so each one of them actually have a meaning. Grade, categorical again. There are multiple different grades at which you actually entered the job. Number of years in, both external and internal, that is more quantitative, right? So this is where we want to be careful about the richness of data. You have grades, you have education, you have sex, you have the PC job. Okay, all of these are categorical data that really enriches the data set in ways that we'll see in the next few minutes. Let's take a quick look into association before we move on from the conceptual model. PC job to salary. Yes versus no. How does it impact salary? Positive. So if it is yes, then it's a higher salary. Sex, male versus female. It's hard to digest that, but it's a reality. It could go either way, right? I so wish so. I have lived this battle long enough. And, you know, I graduate more females from my supply chain program than males. And this has been a continuous trend in over the last 6 years. And things are changing, I must say, but it's changing at a very slow rate. And especially in the supply chain world, most of my graduates go to work for manufacturing, which has traditionally been a man's world. And so my female students or graduates face their own share of exploitation, if you will. And so it still is quite a bit of ceiling to catch up with. So I wish I could define this as a plus minus, but I'll just be rational and logical, and I'll put this as a plus with males driving more salary than females. If you look into everything else remaining the same. Now, the moment you bring in education and try to parse it, it's a different story. But just stand alone. Age. Again, the assumption is that age typically goes with experience. Yes, no? So that's also going to drive. Education, again, higher education. Grade, higher grade scale. Internal years of experience, external years of experience. How do you go about that with salary? Both are probably positive. Anybody wants to make a case for a negative in any of those? And if you had to make a case for a negative, what would that case be? Very, very nicely said, nepotism. So you want fresher ideas. You want people from outside to think outside of the box. And therefore, oftentimes, when you bring in people from outside, it's always a jack up as opposed to people from inside. That's one way of thinking through it. The other way is the Indiana state way, right? Everything has to be internally modulated. So people from outside don't have a chance. It has to be internally governed. If you look into the Indiana state structure within administration, it's extremely internally pushed. Okay, and that's a common scenario across many other companies too. It's not just Indiana state per se. So it could go either direction. Okay, so I just leave that to your good judgment as to how you want to perceive that notion. So eventually, as you run this model, so this conceptual model, as you run this statistically, it will give you an understanding of together how good they are as a set of factors to impact salary. Okay, it will give you that idea. It will also provide you whether all of these factors actually impact salary. Some do, some don't. It'll give you all of those individual clauses that we have set up in the hypothesis. But what I'm after is the data set, which is different from the previous one. What are some of the subsets or the sub-problems that we can conjure up based off of the data that has been provided to us? And this one can take us to many different directions. So let's have a quick discussion on that. What's the easiest one? And always ask yourself, if there are multiple categorical variables, are they looped? Can they be looped one within the other? And therein goes your subcategory. So we just talked about it. Males, females, necessarily not, right? So what can dictate, under what circumstances can female employees draw a higher salary than males? Absolutely. So if you just look into males versus females and you draw that data and do the analysis, maybe you'll find the males gearing on an average more salary than the females, and that may meet your hypothesis. But if you look into education level, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then for each of those levels, if you do a male female analysis for each one of them, that may be a very different outcome depending on the level of education that you have, depending on the years of experience that you have. So this is what we define as interaction. So this is where the idea of a pivot table comes in, where you actually cluster all of these data, break it into meaningful buckets. But again, the reason I ask you to do this by hand first, or at least visualize, is it allows you to understand what you want to do with the data, or else you don't know which direction you want to go. There's too much out there. And we won't stop here. Next week, we will discuss this again from a visualization perspective, especially using Tableau. That should be interesting. Okay, because one of the big powers of Tableau or similar software is to be able to provide a dashboard. Okay, a dashboard is an opportunity, a platform for decision makers to see the entire process in a nutshell. And that's where the thought process starts happening. What do I want to show? What is it that I want the decision maker to see? And a lot of that comes from these subsets or these sub-levels. Okay, what is it that I want to infer? What makes the process interesting? What would make this outcome as a result interesting to get out with? Okay, so that's where many of these subsets, and especially when you have categorical data, these subsets are as important as it gets. Okay, so you have age, you have gender, you have grades, and you have education. So when you look into slicing that data into all of these different levels, in essence, you have multiple buckets. So I'll give you an example. You have education that has how many levels? Finished high school through, obtained a graduate degree, right? 5 levels of education. Within each level of education, you can ideally, and again, for certain cases, you will find that higher the level of education, certain job grades don't even apply to those higher levels. But ideally, you would be able to put the same set of job grades for each education level, right? So if I have 1 to 6 different job grades, and I put that for each education level, how many varieties do I have? 30, right? 5 education types, 6 different job grades for each of those 5 education types. That's 30 classifications. Everybody with me? Yes, no? Whether I have a PC job or not, for each of those 30 classifications, that makes it how many classifications? 60? Yes, no? And for each of those 60 classifications, whether the person is a male or a female, which makes it how many classifications? 120. That is how much you can slice and dice a data set. Now, you will of course find certain sections or classifications that have no data in it. It is normal. You do not expect somebody with a graduate degree, as an example, to do a grade 1 job. That's just not going to happen. So hopefully you will not find that kind of a connectivity, but sometimes it's possible. But that's the ideal scenario, that everything is classified equally across all. 120 possible classifications of trying to understand an outcome, understand salary. And when you have salaries that is distributed across those possible classifications, now you can slice and dice, you can compare each one of them and try and understand what's going on. Why are they different? Are they different statistically or are they not? How does that help decision making? If it turns out that internally there is an opportunity to rise up to, let's say, grade level 3, and that's where you would eventually start when you graduate with a bachelor's degree. So those two classes have the same salary or similar salary for grade level 3. Then you go back and ask the question, if that is the case, who do I recruit from? Because I have completely two different groups of people. One is probably having a high school education, grew up the ladder internally. They have their own set, understand the company culture, learn the job from scratch. They have a very different skill set as opposed to somebody who has seen the world, who has been through an education, who is trying to apply, and who has actually paid for education. That's a different story too. And so that's just two different groups of people, and how do I balance them? So an HR person can actually use this data set to try and find the right balance of workforce that's needed to get the best out of everybody, so that one can challenge the other to get innovation running within a department. Okay, so all of those works can be done based off this data. Again, the slicing part really helps if it's done correctly. And that's where visualization works at its best. So eventually, in the next couple of weeks cycle, as we start looking into visualization, we will readdress all of these problems. I don't want to go beyond a certain examples just because we have only touched the tip of the iceberg here. Okay, it only makes sense when we look at the same data set, but only from multiple angles and see where we started and where we end. So eventually, in the next couple of weeks, we will revisit some of these data sets and we'll say, okay, now that we have learned about visualization, I can say a little bit more than, let's say, all of these subsets or subset problems that we are talking about. I can go deeper than this and tell myself that maybe I'll draw a bar chart that shows the difference between these. Maybe there is a whisker box chart that will help me make the differentiation between these. Maybe there is some kind of a pie chart. Where does this apply? And that will help me decide what goes into a dashboard. So that's how visualization techniques are done. You just don't have a data set and you start putting them into all possible different directions and say, here you go. It always is a process. You have to ask yourself, which direction am I heading? Why am I heading that direction? What do I get out of this? What would a decision maker get out of this? Because once you connect those dots, then it becomes a question of, okay, how do I get there? The how do I get there part, and I'm going to repeat this one more time, is easy. Where to go is the hard question. Okay? What to do with the data set is the hard question. How do I get there is always an easy one. This is where you need to really start thinking. If I have a problem set up, what do I do with that? Why would somebody be interested? What kind of decisions can somebody make off of that problem? Because the moment you are able to articulate your thoughts around, if this is the decision that somebody wants to make, this is the kind of way I want to represent my data. Then the only missing piece is, okay, what tool do I use to make that representation? That's an easy part. The hard part is, how do I represent it in the way somebody is asking for it so that they can make meaning out of it? That's the hard part.